Rachel Maddow Show, weeknights at 9 Eastern on MSNBC.
We knew this day would come. We did not know exactly when. As recently as yesterday, there were people who are paid to talk for a living who were assuring us that this day would definitely not come today, but it's come today. The time has, in fact, arrived. And my friends, we must now gather together to poof Marco Rubio. We started with 17 people all got in over the course of last spring and summer. Nobody got out until September 11th, when the first one we got to poof was Rick Perry. 10 days later, we got to poof Scott Walker. Then we went almost another 2 months without being able to poof anyone until finally, bye-bye Bobby Jindal. A month after that, right before Christmas, we got to poof Lindsey Graham. Poof. And then between Christmas and New Year's, we were supposed to poof George Pataki, but it was between Christmas and New Year's. There was a lot of other stuff going on, and it was George Pataki. And honestly, we kind of forgot to poof him. But Governor Pataki, we owe it to you. Poof, December 29th. Then after Iowa, at the start of February, in quick succession, we got to poof Mike Huckabee, Rand Paul, Rick Santorum. A week and a half later, after New Hampshire, it was a conflagration of poofing as we lost in quick succession Chris Christie, poof, Carly Fiorina, poof, and Jim Gilmore, poof. Then a week later, after South Carolina, the Bush family's long multi-generational winning streak ended in that state, and we got to poof Jeb Bush. And now we have arrived in the month of March, and in the first week of March, we pulled a little bit of a Pataki here on the show when I forgot to poof Ben Carson. There was no real reason I forgot to poof Ben Carson, just that every time I started thinking about it and working on that segment, I got distracted, my mind wandered. It was totally on me. Earlier this month, I forgot to poof Ben Carson when he quit on March 4th, but he did quit, poof, and then we were down to 4. And so the field of candidates that was so giant to begin with, we've had to poof so many of these people over the past few months to get down to this little group we've got left. You would think that we would be used to it and it wouldn't be a big deal anymore. But it always feels like a big deal when somebody drops out of the race. And now in particular, when you're down to this tiny number of people still left in the race, it is kind of dramatic to lose one. It's also dramatic to lose people from the Republican race right now, to keep poofing people off what started as such a giant roster of candidates, because now we are starting to think seriously about the prospect that maybe the Republican Party will poof everybody off this list, that they will not just get down to one, they will get down to none. I mean, it is a fairly open discussion in some Republican Party circles right now about whether the Republican Party will add a new potential nominee to the mix at their convention in Cleveland, somebody who's not been running in the race already for the past year. It's hard to believe you can't find one person you like out of 17 candidates, but they really might try to find the one Republican who didn't actually find time to run for president this year, and they might give the nomination to that person instead because they don't like any of the 17. Today, former Republican House Speaker John Boehner said in Ohio that he would be happy to go with that kind of a plan. John Boehner has just said that if none of the remaining candidates in the race get a majority of delegates on the first ballot at the convention this summer, then he says none of those candidates should get the nomination. And he also says none of those candidates would get his vote. He says at that point, after just one ballot, he'd be happy to pick somebody altogether new, and his pick would be the current House Speaker, Paul Ryan. And if this line of reasoning sounds familiar, it's because Paul Ryan got the House Speaker's job not that long ago after a similar dynamic emerged in the leadership of the Republican Party, not in terms of their presidential candidate, but in terms of who would be their leader in Congress. The Republican Party needed a new Speaker of the House after John Boehner unexpectedly resigned last fall. Dozens of possible candidates emerged from within the Republican Party. Literally, there were tons of them. We tried to line them all up and pick them out like an eye chart at one point, and it was very hard to do. I mean, even some potential House Speaker candidates who weren't actually members of Congress, just random outside Republicans that they thought they might tap for the job to come in and take over for John Boehner, even they were among the people discussed as possible House Speakers. And yes, Paul Ryan is now saying absolutely not to the prospect that the Republican National Convention might turn to him this summer, that they might turn to somebody completely outside the presidential contest thus far to save the party and step in and become a fresh new nominee, unsullied by the primary process. Yes, Paul Ryan is saying no to that now. But remember, when the Speaker's job was the job that was open in the Republican Party, he also said no to that job. He said no 1,000 times in 1,000 ways that he liked his current job. He absolutely did not want to be Speaker of the House and would not be Speaker of the House. But you know what? He's now Speaker of the House. And so, who knows? Donald Trump may end up being the Republican nominee. John Kasich or Ted Cruz might end up being the Republican nominee. We may well end up poofing Donald Trump and John Kasich and Ted Cruz off the list of candidates before this process is done. I mean, maybe the Republican Party really will have ended up considering all 17 of their potential declared candidates this year, and maybe they will reject all of them. But we're not there yet. And today, it really is a big deal for this epic race on the Republican side that it has now gone from 4 people to 3 people. So let's do it. You ready? Say it with me now. Senator Rubio. 3, 2, 1. Ooh. Senator Marco Rubio is used to getting absolutely fawning national press coverage. And good for him. You know, people criticize him for getting this. It's a skill to get good press coverage. He's really good at getting good press coverage. I mean, his hometown press in Florida doesn't treat him with nearly the same suck-uppitude as the national press does, but the national press has serious suck-uppitude for Marco Rubio. They treat him so well, it is almost creepy. The national press has portrayed him almost literally as a messiah figure for his party. He's been the guy whose concession speeches were treated like victory speeches. In this campaign, he's the guy who was lauded in the press as not just a top-tier competitor, but even the likely nominee of the Republican Party this year, even as real voters in state after state after state after state kept saying no, they did not want him over and over and over again. And then in his home state last night, Marco Rubio did not just lose by a lot. Last night in his home state, this is not a typo. This is not a screwing up the graphic or somebody dropping their lipstick on the slide. This is the result last night in Florida. Marco Rubio lost 66 out of 67 counties in the state. And so then last night he had to quit this presidential race. And so that brings us to today, which, of course, would end up being a very different kind of day for Marco Rubio than he was used to from the press, right? After a lifetime worth of positive national press crammed into these few short years he's had in national politics, Marco Rubio today had to brace himself for the first full day of terrible press coverage he has ever had in his life, right? Today was Marco Rubio political obituary day. But unlike a real obituary where people say nice things about you because you're gone, in a political obituary, you're not really gone, you're just a failure. So nobody tends to hold back on saying every bad thing they ever thought about you and listing everything you ever did wrong in your life, let alone this campaign. And so, right, this is one of the reasons that you probably don't want to go into politics, statistically speaking, right? I mean, this doesn't happen in every industry, but for politicians, they have what I've always thought of as salt in the wound day, day after losing day. Right? It's the day after you have the worst public career humiliation of your life. If you're a big enough deal as a politician, after you have that terrible public humiliation and failure, you have to spend the next day reading all about how terribly you blew it and how you deserved it and blah. So Marco Rubio had to brace for that today. After quitting last night, that's what Marco Rubio knew he was going to have to do today. Until he didn't have to do that at all. Because apparently, for Marco Rubio, there is yet one more gift from the gods of the national political media. Yes, yes, this happened today before lunchtime. Yes, thank you, President Obama. Thank you, Supreme Court nomination process. Thank you, gods and goddesses of limited news cycle attention spans and fortuitous timing. Today, the best day of Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland's life just stepped on the tail of what was all set to be the worst day in the political life of Marco Rubio. I mean, guess what pushed the end of Marco Rubio's political career completely out of the news cycle today? Woohoo! Thank you. And for that, surely Judge Merrick Garland should be able to count on a payback thank you vote from Marco Rubio in the United States Senate, right? Maybe. I'm fairly certain that will actually not happen, although the rules of karma say that it should. We're in this interesting moment, though, now, because now we've got a Supreme Court nominee. Not just a Supreme Court vacancy, not just a Supreme Court issue and a debate. Now we've got a name. Now we've got a person. We've got a record. We've got a resume. And we're going to be talking this hour with both Dahlia Lithwick and Nina Totenberg about Judge Merrick Garland and his prospects of becoming Justice Merrick Garland. We're going to be talking about what this nomination means. But this nomination happened today in the context of this red-hot political campaign that we're in right now, right? This unusually insane process we're having this year of trying to choose a successor to President Obama. I mean, today alone, we've got Senator Rubio dropping out of the race. We've got the real prospect that Marco Rubio may go further than quitting the presidential race. He may actually quit his U.S. Senate seat rather than return to it. Part of the way Senator Rubio campaigned for the presidency was by talking openly about how much he hated the job of being a U.S. Senator, bragging about the fact that he basically never shows up for that job, trying to turn his worst voting record in the Senate into some sort of political advantage because he hates the Senate so much. He's been open about that, right? So there's the prospect that he will also quit the Senate. That's out there today. We've also got former Rubio supporters in the state of Pennsylvania tonight dropping their legal challenges, which could have potentially kept Ohio Governor John Kasich off the presidential ballot in Pennsylvania. And there was some question about the signatures that John Kasich's campaign filed to get Governor Kasich onto the Pennsylvania ballot. But those challenges to his eligibility, those are challenges that came from Marco Rubio supporters, and those challenges have now been dropped in the wake of Senator Rubio quitting the race. I mean, everybody thinks Marco Rubio's supporters and his donors and his campaign infrastructure are all going to go to Ted Cruz, but maybe this is a little sign that John Kasich could be in the running for some of that, too. Who knows? I mean, John Kasich certainly seems like he'd be a better bet than Ted Cruz when it comes to running against Donald Trump in forthcoming states like Pennsylvania and Maryland and Connecticut and maybe Wisconsin and New York and New Jersey and Delaware, maybe even Utah, which votes next week. Wouldn't John Kasich potentially run better than Ted Cruz against Donald Trump in those states? Then, simultaneously, there's also the fate of the Stop Donald Trump effort within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. So not just the guys who are running against him, but the effort within the party to try to stop him. Politico.com reports now that there will be yet another conservative summit in Washington, D.C. tomorrow to again try to stop Mr. Trump's march to the nomination. And who knows, maybe this one will do the trick. But these efforts within the Republican Party and within the conservative movement to try to stop Donald Trump, I mean, they did just get a big full-scale road test in the great state of Florida, where the $15 million spent just against Donald Trump in that one state in advance of last night's vote, that $15 million anti-Trump dollars, $15 million, that positively dwarfs anything spent against any other candidate or for any other candidate in that state. And the result, we now know, of that massive, concentrated, sustained anti-Donald Trump onslaught in the state of Florida was that Donald Trump last night won 66 out of the 67 counties in the state of Florida. And he polished off his earlier meal of the state's former Republican governor with a tasty dessert of the state's Messiah junior senator. So now we've got this nominee, this Supreme Court nominee. Republicans in the Senate say that Judge Merrick Garland will never get a hearing, let alone a vote, let alone confirmed, as long as Barack Obama is still president of the United States. And everybody's entitled to say how they see things. Everybody's entitled to make their own threats in politics. But for his part, President Obama seems to think that picking this particular nominee is his best chance of getting around those political threats. And that is in part because of who Judge Merrick Garland is, but it is also in part because Judge Garland's nomination is happening now. Judge Garland's nomination is happening this year in this political environment with all this mishigas as the background political noise in the Republican Party. President Obama seems to think that in this time and in this place, with the national politics we're having right now, Merrick Garland is the one key that will turn in this particular lock. Is he right? Joining us now is my friend Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor at Slate. Dahlia, I'm so glad you could be with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Is Merrick Garland a liberal or a moderate?
He's liberal moderate. He's somewhere between the two. I think that, one thing we can say is he's got a 19-year judicial record, Rachel. So whatever he is, he's not a mystery. And I think he's pretty much a Obama kind of reach across the aisle, consensus building, incremental judicial humility, moderate liberal guy.
One of the other criteria that was touted about some of the other people who were said to be on the short list for this pick were that they had been confirmed to their most recent federal judgeship with 0 votes against them. That was true of a few other people on the short lists that had been circulated in the media. That's not actually true of Judge Garland. There were more than 20 votes against him when he was confirmed to his current job as Chief Justice on the D.C. Circuit Court. What was that about, and should that be seen as relevant to his political viability?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, it was a very, very hotly contested confirmation and nomination, and it lagged for months and months and months. But I think probably the most useful number is that there were 8 Republicans who are sitting Republicans now who did vote for him. And I think not even the vote, Rachel, but the rhetoric around him subsequently has been so interesting, because no less a person than Orrin Hatch said very recently, if Obama wanted to be reasonable, he'd give us a moderate candidate like Merrick Garland. And so they talk about him as though he is a centrist person that they can confirm, very recently talking about him that way. And then suddenly he's named and they're like, Obama's just fake reasonable. So, this is not just the vote itself, but the language around him, which has been so supportive. He's such a beloved figure across the board. So many former solicitors general have come out and said, this is your guy across the aisle. And yet it doesn't matter what the vote was. It doesn't matter what they said about him. Now that he's the pick, he is, a pot-smoking hippie liberal.
The president's strategy here, the way you're laying that out, seems very clear, right? This is somebody who might be the hardest person in the country for Republican senators to say no to, particularly not Republican senators in the abstract, but the Republican senators who are currently in the United States Senate and have to face this promise that they've all made that he's not going to get a hearing. That's obviously the take that that's the tack that the White House took with this choice. Do you agree that that was the right strategy to take? Obviously, there's other ways to do it. You can pick somebody who can really galvanize liberals to try to make this a general election issue, to try to help the Democratic nominee by effectively putting the Supreme Court nominee on the ticket with Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. You can approach it through some sort of bank shot where you elevate somebody because you then want to put somebody else in their seat, and you can campaign in either of them. What do you think about the president's strategic choice here?
I was the person not a week ago saying, put up Elizabeth Warren, put Deval Patrick, put someone who's going to galvanize the base, get out the vote, who's basically going to be Hillary's mini-me vice president who just stumps for, months saying, give me a hearing, and make it somebody that the base is excited about. And even, I think it's fair to say, Sri Srinivasan, Jane Kelly, some of the people who were on the short list until the last second, even though I think they would be called moderate centrists, left, but certainly I think people who everybody could have lived with, they would have at least had this sort of demographic appeal. Maybe he'd be putting up the first African-American woman, maybe he'd be putting up the first Hindu. All that falls away when he makes the decision to put up not just a white guy from Harvard, like we haven't had a million of those on this court, but a white guy from Harvard who's 63, right, who's easily 12, 13 years older than a lot of the other people on the short list. And I think that the reason is exactly what you said. He just made the decision, Rachel, that he was going to use this, I think, to box in Republicans, to force them, particularly Republicans in contested races in the Senate, to go back and say, I'm not voting for him. I'm not even meeting him. When he walks down the hall, I'm going to hide under my desk. But no, he's not even real to me. And I think that it was an effort to do that, to sort of say, you live with the fact that I put up, an incredibly moderate, reasonable white person who you lauded only recently, and you won't even shake his hand.
Trying to push that resistance to the breaking point, which will set a weird precedent if and when it doesn't break. Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor at Slate. I was so looking forward to talking to you about this. Thanks for being here, Dahlia.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
I will say that with this nominee, we don't know exactly what the president was thinking, and we don't know what's going to happen next. We're going to be talking with Nina Totenberg about this a little bit later on in the hour. It is my sense that the White House cannot expect that Merrick Garland is going to end up on the Supreme Court at the end of this process. Republicans in the Senate say they're not going to hear him. If a Republican wins the presidential election, Republicans in the Senate then definitely aren't going to hear him. If a Democrat wins the presidential election, I think that Democratic nominee will want his or her own nominee to put forward, right? Maybe they'll pick the same person that President Obama picked, but more likely they'd pick their own. I think the president does not expect that Merrick Garland will end up on the court, but the White House probably calculates if something goes crazy in this most unpredictable political seasons that we're in, if Merrick Garland does end up getting a vote for some reason, the country would be in safe hands. I think that's their calculation. That said, I'm completely making that up. We'll be right back.
The full video podcast is no longer available, but The Rachel Maddow Show still is. Check out the full episode audio podcast or watch the show online anytime at now.msnbc.com.